I'm Marianna Spring, and this is Some Dare Call It Conspiracy.
Welcome to Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. We have got a very special gift for you today, an interview with fan and friend of the show, Marianna Spring. Marianna is the disinformation and social media correspondent at the BBC. You may know her from her Undercover Voters investigations, Americast, Panorama, and critically acclaimed podcasts Death by Conspiracy, War and Truth, and Disaster Trolls, which features both myself and Neil in our very own episodes. Disaster Trolls has just been named Best Podcast of 2022 according to The Observer and Mashable.com. Before we start, a quick heads up. This is a Christmas special, so we do start off with a few softball questions, but it doesn't take long to get into the nitty-gritty. And of course, with the BBC correspondent present, we were not going to miss the opportunity to discuss the concerns about BBC bias, what makes them the arbiter of truth, Building 7, are you investigating vaccine injuries, and Jimmy Savile. We get into it all. Hi, Marianna.
Hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, really great for you to join us. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate this.
Nice to see you both.
Thank you for joining our Christmas special. What is your traditional Christmas day?
My traditional Christmas day is spent with hopefully less conspiracies, other than the conspiracy theory that Father Christmas is real. I spend it with my close family, so my parents and my sister usually, and our very lovely cat called Mia, who unfortunately most years I get some kind of dreadful costume for her to wear. Last year she had a this year I've ordered her, spoiler, not that she can speak English, I've ordered her a sort of like hood, a sort of little like, actually kind of Illuminati-esque.
Oh, there you go.
Uh-oh.
A little Christmas hood with some baubles on it.
Well, if anyone's in the Illuminati, cats are.
Yeah,
absolutely.
True.
Yeah, they're
True.
not to be trusted.
True. And this Christmas so it'll be our kind of usual Christmas day, but also I am going through the first round of edits for my book, which I'm writing at the moment, which is Amongst the Trolls, Notes from the Disinformation War, which will be out next year. And so I'm kind of going through that at the moment. I'm hoping to include some new bits from the Disaster Trolls podcast and from you guys' interviews. So it'd be great to feature you in the book, hopefully. And so I'm doing lots of updates and stuff like that. So to my family's dismay, I won't be very good at switching off.
So you will be slaying conspiracies over Christmas.
That's terrible, Brent.
I am the pun king.
What's your favourite Christmas song?
Oh, I do quite like a classic, just to Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas. I'm quite boring. There's one, there's a few, I can't remember the name of the one. I used to really like this cartoon film about reindeers. Is it the Paul McCartney one? A Wonderful Christmas Time. I like that.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, fair enough.
Those are my favourites. Very basic of me.
What's the first one you put on, Neil? Do you even put any on?
It's the Pogues. Like, I'm just listening to the Pogues. It's the Pogues, like, because I like the Pogues anyway. And if I'm feeling very charitable, I might put on the one by the Pretenders. But other than that, they can all sod off. I'm sorry, but they can.
Yeah, first one I put on every year is Step Into Christmas.
Who's
That's
that?
it. Elton John.
Oh, that one. Right, yeah, fair enough.
It gets me in the mood every year.
What was your favourite ever Christmas gift there, Marianna?
Ooh, I feel like I've had lots of very nice presents.
Wasn't a notebook and a pen, was it, or anything
You know
journalistic?
what? I was about to say something really embarrassing, and I was about to say, when I was at school, I remember asking for a fountain pen for Christmas.
Oh, nice.
It was one of the ones that was in either the 20s or the 30s. Women used to wear those really small ones around their necks.
Okay.
And I still have it. It's a little blue ink pen that you kind of fill up yourself with the well. And I really like that. I just think it's quite a cool present relative to, I feel like all the other things I get are usually, I don't know, slightly more boring, like a pair of earrings or, sorry, that's my email. a pair of earrings or jewellery or stuff like that. So yeah, the ink pen can be my favourite, which is very on brand.
Was that because you were interested in journalism from an early age, or were you doing short stories or something like that?
I was very interested in journalism from an early age. So I used to be obsessed on my holidays with watching BBC World News whenever we were in the UK, and making my younger sister sit and watch these like quite frightening news stories about what was going on in the world. And I was just really interested. And I remember asking my mum, you know, what job is this where you get to kind of investigate what's going on and tell people about it? And she was like, oh, it's being a journalist. And ever since then, I was really interested in it. I did lots of reporting for my local paper when I was at school. And that was around the time I asked for the ink pen. And I had so many notebooks, but I'm guilty of, and I still do it now, sort of starting notebooks, and I use them for about 3 pages and then I lose them, or I have to get new ones.
I have the same. I have the same from all the lyric writing. Just
I was going to say, you're full of rhymes.
Yeah.
Did you ever write rhymes, Marianna?
No, not really. I did write short. I did used to like writing stories though, and I used to sort of write them in these notebooks particularly when I was like quite little, like in primary school. And my mum and dad used to turn up the radio just very slowly, so I'd stop reading loud. My book.
Oh, marvellous. Did you have any sort of like, who were your sort of journalistic heroes then? Who was anyone that you sort of was inspired by?
I feel like in a very cliched way, I've always really liked the BBC and watched the BBC, and I was particularly when I was younger, I was always, you know, I was already a fan of people like Emily Maitlis and Lise Doucette, a lot of the kind of foreign reporting, a lot of I mean, like Jeremy Bowen, and there are people who I find it amazing because I'm like, wow, I know them, I talk to them.
I was going to say, surely you've met some of these people.
Yeah, I have, and they're all brilliant, and I find it kind of astounding being able to sort of watch. To meet them and think, wow, I used to like love watching you, or be really interested in the kind of reporting that you did. I also was really interested, but this was more sort of at university really rather than when I was little, but all stuff about the New York Times and the She Said movement, and the kind of film that's out right now, but Jodie Cantor and Megan, whose surname I'm always really bad at pronouncing. I was always kind of really inspired by them, and it's amazing watching the film that's out right now, because you just get such an insight into the way that you build up investigations, particularly with sources, and I've always really liked those journalists who kind of speak truth to power, which is why when the trolls tell me that I hate people speaking truth to power, I don't like it very much.
So how did you get to work for the BBC? What sort of ritual did you have to perform?
After I'd sacrificed a goat, I then that is a joke, by the way, if you're listening.
It's all right, our audience will get that, definitely.
Yeah, good. I was always really interested in journalism. I did writing for my local paper, and when I was at university, I studied languages, so I studied Russian and French. So when I was on my year abroad, where you kind of go out and live in Russia and France, I did some reporting for the Moscow Times, so kind of writing English language news stories, and for the Local, which is a kind of European news site when I lived in Paris, and also for a little local newspaper called Le Temps Libre, which is in the southwest of France. And then I also did some work experience at The Guardian and at Private Eye, which was incredible. And it was off the back of that, really. So I started doing kind of more work at The Guardian. I did some stories about, specifically about Russia. So domestic violence laws changing in Russia, and women sort of having to pay the fines of their abusers, and some stuff about the kind of Me Too movement actually in Russia. And then one of the journalists I work with at The Guardian, who is a lovely reporter called Lexi Topping, who's recently actually done a lot of the Tim Westwood investigation of anyone.
Oh, yeah.
Doing that. She was my first ever, I feel like, mentor. And she said to me, oh, why don't you, I'd started doing some more shifts at The Guardian. I just finished at university. And at the time I was doing sort of news reporting. And she said, oh, why don't you send some links to some of the journalism you've done to people you admire at the BBC? And so I emailed lots of those various people I mentioned to you as people I liked, including Emily Maitlis, the then Newsnight presenter. And she replied to me and said, oh, well, you sound brilliant. Why don't you come and talk to our deputy editor, and you could come in and do a shift or so, which is where you work on Newsnight. So you're kind of calling up guests and seeing who could come on the programme and stuff like that. And it started from there, really. So I did that to begin with. And then I got more involved in investigations. So doing stuff on no deal Brexit and the kind of implications that could have. And then after that, I did some investigations for Newsnight about the European elections in 2019 and the disinformation and hate in Facebook groups. And I've always been really interested in social media investigations. I think because I studied Russian as well. So the kind of influence operations and that kind of stuff had been particularly high on the agenda after the 2016 US election. And so that's kind of where this all came from that. So I covered the 2019 election and social media around that. And then the BBC thought, oh, it would be good if we had a dedicated reporter who investigates disinformation and social media in the same way that quite a lot of the US broadcasters had similar roles. And then I started doing this job, and there were no goats sacrificed.
Oh, well, I mean, you would say that though, wouldn't you? But so, I mean, what are the dangers of disinformation?
So doing my job, one of the, I mean, a lot of what I focused on has been the real world harm that it can have. So particularly during the pandemic, and I started doing this job not long before the pandemic started, and the kind of trolls will often say, ha, this is why they created her role, because they wanted to suppress the truth about the pandemic. And actually, the role I'm doing was made with a view to covering the US election, which was coming up at the end of that year. But then the pandemic happened, and so I found myself very busy. And a lot of my reporting focused on the real world harm of people thinking that COVID-19 wasn't real, that it was caused 5G technology, or that it wasn't serious, not following health advice, and losing their lives in the most extreme cases. The other dangers posed by disinformation that I've covered a lot are threats to democracy around the US election, for example, and we saw that with the riots at the Capitol. Disinformation around the war in Ukraine and the real people kind of targeted by that information warfare, accused of acting or other things. Most recently in disaster trolls, which both of you featured in, the most extreme conspiracies targeting terror survivors and suggesting they're lying about what happened to them. And I also focus quite a lot on hate and abuse as well, and trolling and how that plays out.
How would you respond to criticism that basically, I mean, what some people would say is that this is the BBC setting themselves up as the yardstick or the arbiter of truth? How would you respond to that criticism?
What I usually say is that I think journalists across the board, whether that's working for the BBC or anywhere else, our job is as truth tellers and to investigate the truth. And that's not something new. That's something that journalists have, been doing for decades in different ways. I think that the way that my role works is I'm not telling people, what they should believe or should not believe. I'm looking at the evidence and I'm looking at when there's specific disinformation that is extreme and contrary to the evidence and harmful. And a lot of the reason I focus on the real world impact is because I want to show people that this isn't just an exercise in fact checking, saying you're wrong and I'm right and here's what happens. This is about real people who can be harmed, and it's really important to expose how that works, not only to show the real harm it can do, and as a public service broadcaster for our licence fee payers who can be quite seriously harmed by this, but also to hold to account the people who have responsibility here, the social media companies, policymakers, law enforcement, all of whom, if we choose not to cover this and to be too squeamish and not to talk about it, that makes their lives a lot easier. And as journalists, if we're making people's lives easier, that is not good.
No, exactly.
Absolutely. So how would you go about deciding what is a reliable source for information?
It's a really good question. I think that, a lot of the colleagues I work with at the BBC, for example, the fact-checking team at Reality Check, which, is a really important team that exists, they go about, when they're unpicking this stuff, they're doing much more of the kind of very straightforward debunking. For me, it's often actually picking out some of the most extreme conspiracy theories. So, COVID-19 is a hoax, it doesn't exist, or the Manchester Arena bombing never happened, or, stuff that's, I think, to the average person is not so confusing. It's quite clear cut.
Yeah.
And in terms of sourcing that, it's then very much about talking to the real people. So I spend a lot of time tracking people down, talking to people who were eyewitnesses, to kind of gathering together their testimony and figuring out what happened. A good example of that was for the War on Truth podcast I did for Radio 4. There was this attack on this hospital in Mariupol, and this woman, also called Marianna, was falsely accused by the Russian state of being an actress, and that she was playing a part in this attack. And in order to sort of investigate that, it involved a combination of things. It involved kind of looking at Google Maps to match up, where did this happen and why, and looking at how that contradicted what the Russian state was saying. It tracking down people that knew this woman Marianna, who confirmed she was pregnant, who confirmed she was in the hospital. It involved tracking her down and speaking directly to her in Russian and asking her questions. All of those things for me are kind of part of how I piece stuff together. The same with COVID-19. I've dealt probably less so in the more complex allegations about COVID, and much more so in the kind of clear cut stuff. So we did Death by Conspiracy with the lovely producer Anne Dean, who you guys have met. That was very much about someone who believed that COVID wasn't real, which all the evidence suggests to us that it has been real, and how he was drawn into sometimes the more nuanced disinformation, sometimes the stuff which started with a grain of truth and then expanded beyond that. And at the time of doing that podcast was when the Partygate scandal was breaking, and I was interviewing people at anti-lockdown rallies, and they were saying to me, well, the fact that these politicians were breaking the rules, does that not tell us that this wasn't as serious as they thought, and so on? So for me, often it's about saying, well, that's a really, you're totally entitled to criticize government or whoever you want, but that doesn't mean that COVID wasn't real and that people who lost family members or lost loved ones are making it up, or that it didn't happen. So I mean, obviously that involves talking to scientists, it involves talking to experts across a range of fields, but I kind of think sometimes that when you rely only on those testimonies, it's just not powerful enough, because people who already distrust doctors or scientists or the institutions are going to say, well, you're obviously just asking all the people who agree with what you say. And so that's why I actually, hearing directly from people who are affected, people who say, oh, my cousin died of, he thought COVID wasn't real and he died, and here's the impact it had on me. Or, I was the person photographed outside that hospital and here's what happened. I sometimes think it's the most effective way of combating the disinformation.
Well, I mean, the human angle does also basically go to a point to debunk some of the sort of more outlandish parts of the theory. For example, with Martin, the theory is that he wasn't disabled, or that he was disabled prior to Manchester bombing. You've met him, you've seen the footage of him walking in there. We now know what's happened to him. So in that sense, but it would be fair to say that you look more for the human angle and then hope that the debunking comes from that, rather than look at, say, every aspect of a theory and go through it point by point and go, well, this can't be true, this can't be true, this can't be true. But just because, I mean, that must be quite frustrating, that some of the criticism that is leveled against you is that, well, you've not looked at this point and you've not looked at this point. And, as we've found, you need hours and hours and hours to go through the points, basically.
Absolutely. And so I think it's for that reason that one of the reasons I focus on the human cost is because I think that there are a limited number of investigations and stories you can do. And so it helps to focus on the ones that are the most harmful. I also think it's about the audience and also about the format and the style. So when you're doing podcasts or panorama investigations or online pieces, you don't always have the space or the time or even the kind of audience to really be able to unpick every single allegation in the way you guys do. And a lot of the audience you're dealing with are sometimes people who are totally new to this topic, or they don't know anything about disinformation, or they don't know anything about, trolling kind of firsthand. They haven't experienced it. And when you've got that slightly less specialized audience, I think that the human impact can be a really good way of drawing them in. And I also think that it weaponizes, I hope, some of the things that make disinformation go viral in the first place, which is kind of capitalizing on stories of real people and suggesting that they've been injured by the vaccine, or that that they're lying about their injuries. And I always say to people as well, and particularly kind of people who are critical of me even existing, that, I also begin from a point of saying, right, I'm going to go and investigate. Maybe this person was really injured by the vaccine. Maybe they telling the truth about this. But very quickly, when I've tracked people down, usually it ends up being the case that they say to me, oh, no, that isn't what happened. Here's what happened.
Okay.
And so it's kind of, because I sometimes think it's the same with Russian disinformation. It's the same with anything. We don't begin from a place of, unless it's very obviously untrue, of presuming that it's untrue. We begin from a place of investigating it, but just often quite quickly the result ends up being, oh, actually, this was misleading or untrue, and here's the harm it's done. And the way I come upon stories is often by people reaching out to me about how they've been affected by hate or disinformation, or social media more generally. And I have to really interrogate and bottom out their stories and source them and speak to multiple people. The number of, if you ever saw my DMs on any Twitter, they're full of people getting in touch with me, but they're also full of me getting in touch with people to try and verify exactly what they're saying to me.
Right.
Because, it wouldn't take much for Russia, for instance, to set up an account who falsely plants a story and someone gets in touch with me and says, oh, this happened to me. And, we can't just, we wouldn't be doing our jobs.
You can't take it on face value.
Yeah.
So that kind of answers a bit of a question. So with regards to the most recent Panorama and disaster trolls, who decided on that story? Were you approached by members of the public, essentially?
Yeah, so I had quite a few people getting in touch with me about terror survivors, and then also people who'd been seeing this play out on social media, getting in touch and saying, oh, look, this is happening. And particularly in light of the trial of Alex Jones happening over in the US, it was very much hot on the news agenda. People were talking about it. And for some of these Manchester survivors in particular, it was almost an enough is enough moment. We don't want to be targeted in this way anymore. It's been causing us lots of distress. Please, could you investigate this? And I came across quite a few threads on Twitter that people had shared with me of very obvious abuse, kind of citing these conspiracy theories to bereaved parents or to people who suffered really awful injuries and accusing them of lying. And you could see kind of up front how distressing that was for the people reaching out to me. And so that's how we started investigating it, really. And we started with the Radio 4 podcast, and then also it was commissioned for Panorama, which is obviously, that's a sort of half an hour, BBC One, BBC iPlayer, and then the podcast was 2.5 hours, over 2.5 hours, but 10, 15-minute episodes that explored how this was unfolding in the UK. And, we were led by what the testimonies were telling us and what the evidence was showing us and the kinds of content we were coming across. And that was how it started.
So just to clarify, members of the public approached you. The BBC didn't come across Richard, decide that Richard was spreading too much truth and that he had to be destroyed. Because obviously that is the criticism that is levelled against you.
No, absolutely not. And we never, if I'm honest, the beginning investigating that for Radio 4 and for Panorama, it certainly wasn't, it was never our intention even to begin with that Richard, for example, would be the focus. It was that this was flagged to us in different forms and different ways, and we set about investigating it to say, all right, where is this coming from? Who's sharing it? Where's it being posted and why? And a lot of the testimonies ended up focusing around one person because of the nature of the tactics and also looking at the way this had spilled offline. But, we interrogated and bottomed out every avenue we could, really, to understand how this was playing out and who was targeting who and how. And the survivors we spoke to for the podcast and the Panorama were in some ways the tip of the iceberg, because there were lots of other people who'd reached out to me and were either too traumatized to talk about it, or who reached out to me subsequently and said, oh, look, this is how I've been targeted. So it really sort of started to unravel a very large group of people who felt very distressed at these tactics, and we tried to centre that around their experiences, because as one of them kind of put to me, if the BBC doesn't cover this and investigate this, for us this goes on, the hate and the conspiracies and the disinformation that's causing really serious distress. We're frightened at home, we're frightened at work. You can choose not to cover it, but that doesn't, and that just felt like, well, we can't not cover it. That would be a totally ignoring our job as a public service broadcaster.
What's the response been to the programme?
It's been very positive. Particularly from the survivors. So the survivors have been really happy that people have been sitting up and taking notice. They were all very, very praising of both of your testimonies and the way that helped them kind of understand how this plays out. There's been really sort of positive reviews of the podcast and lots of kind of news coverage after the panorama. And the thing I think that was most important was that the survivors feel like people are listening, and also that they weren't then targeted by more abuse. They actually have had such an overwhelmingly positive response that, you know, they've all kind of said to me, wow, I've stopped getting the nastiness in the same way I was before. That's a really positive outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, just in case you're interested in the sort of responses that we got, like a lot of it was very positive. What we felt, or what a response that we got from a lot of people was they just simply dismissed it as a hit piece against Richard. Not so much the radio show. The radio show, a lot of people sort of gave it a lot more sort of time. And I appreciate that you're bound by the constraints of time yourself in the program. What we discovered strangely was that a lot of people didn't even engage with it, because basically there was nothing positive about Richard in it at all. They basically assumed it was a hit piece, and the response that we got was, well, she's not even addressed the crack in the ceiling. She's not even addressed why this person was on here and such like that. So that was a response that we got in our sort of milieu. What do you think about that? I mean, like, the problem is with this is that you've got a crowd of people that see you as the establishment. They see you as, with respect, the enemy, and essentially, you know, that you're there to hide the truth because you're part of the establishment. How do you even begin to start approaching those people and trying to get them to listen to your point of view?
Yeah, I think that I mean, when it comes to something like disaster trolls, when you think about, firstly, the kind of different formats you have. So in the podcast, you have the space to interrogate how different people are affected, different people's testimonies, what that tells us, the bigger picture, in a way that in 30 minutes you just don't have. And I often think it is about the audience, in so much as you are often introducing a totally novel concept to the audience. And particularly for us, it ends up when you're the less time you have, the more you end up focusing on the survivors, because it's their testimonies that are leading the investigation. And that certainly was the case with the panorama. I think that when it comes to, I think particularly the kind of forensic unpicking of the conspiracy theories and the kind of, oh, well, actually this evidence, you know, well, what about this evidence? And doesn't that mean this? I think certainly for the panorama, our view was that the testimonies from the survivors who'd lived through this should be, and in my view was powerful enough to kind of combat those mistruths, because why on earth would, you know, ultimately a lot of those mistruths focused around the same thing, which was suggesting this had been staged in some way or that it was fabricated. And why would, you know, this series of people from different attacks, but particularly from Manchester, sit there and tell us about the devastating impact this has had on their lives and be just making it up? And, you know, we extensively questioned their stories and interrogated all of the evidence they shared with us, which was you know, just very definitive in what it told us. There are some people who, as you say, you know, they distrust the BBC, sometimes for very legitimate reasons, and they're not going to ever be receptive to, I think, the kind of reporting I do necessarily. And I like to think, and I hope that there are audiences who, you know, particularly because you both feature and you connect with a wide range of different audiences, but there are some people who might have listened to the podcast who maybe wouldn't have thought about listening to the BBC before. There might be some people who've engaged in that way. And certainly one of the people we interviewed for the podcast series, a woman called Alicia in Wales, she was someone who was interested in these theories, had sort of entertained them, had considered them, contemplated them. And very quickly, when I confronted her with the evidence of having interviewed the real people caught up in these attacks, was very quick to say, oh, wow, okay, hang on a second. That for me is too far and I don't want to be a part of that. And she sent me a lovely message afterwards saying how happy she was with the panorama and the podcast and that she felt really pleased with how she'd been represented. And I hope that there are some people like her who might have listened or might have watched. But I think, unfortunately, this is kind of bigger than me, which is I can only do my reporting and my investigations. But, you know, there are people with deep distrust in the BBC. And I think that ultimately a half an hour panorama, I think in any way is probably not going to affect what they think about the BBC. I think that there are some ways that trust can be built with audiences, certainly ones that don't trust the BBC anymore. And I think that is, you know, it is insightful reporting in this area and investigations in this area, but it's also other investigations holding power to account, showing that the BBC does that and does it well. I like to think that there are people, I had some really positive messages from people who said to me, oh, look, and particularly we found, which is really interesting actually, but the audience that engaged, for example, with the online piece for Disaster Trolls, they were much younger than the usual BBC audience, lots of under 18 to 24s and under 30s, and they fell into the groups of audiences that we just really struggled to reach. They were people who weren't traditionally coming to the BBC, and so a lot of them reached out to me, having listened to the podcast or watched the Panorama. And what I really liked was the people who'd say to me, oh, I saw this Panorama on iPlayer and now I've listened to the whole podcast series.
Oh, excellent.
Were really engaging with the breadth of content. And there were people who said, oh, I'm interested in this because it affects me and I see stuff on social media, and I kind of had been thinking, like, is there something to this stuff? And seeing this really made me sort of sit up and think, oh, hang on a second, what do I want to trust and what do I not want to trust? And so, that I hope is a kind of positive outcome, but you can't please everyone.
What's your opinion of Richard?
It's not really my job to have an opinion of any of these people. I think probably anyone I interview, I want to be able to ask them questions. I want to be able to understand where they're coming from, and I want to be able to hold them to account if there's something important to hold them to account about. And I hope that was what we were able to do in Disaster Trolls, certainly for the survivors who, had spoken to us about that distress. I spent quite a lot of time thinking about why people promote conspiracy theories and the impact that can have. And I think when it comes to pandemic disinformation, for example, it's much easier for the average person to understand why people might believe that kind of conspiracy, because lockdowns were absolutely rubbish. It was really scary. There was so much upheaval, and there are also legitimate examples of failings and incidents that would inspire deep distrust. And when it comes to stuff like the attack at Manchester Arena, having sat down in front of the survivors and just seen the impact on them and how hard it was even for them to talk to me about that day years later, it's harder to understand why people would believe it. But it's also, I think, probably in from my point of view, easier to understand because I see how people, once those words like crisis actor and hoax and state become part of your lexicon, become part of your dictionary, you can see how you then think, if you're able, if someone was able to orchestrate a pandemic, why wouldn't they be doing all these horrible, evil things? And I was recently doing an interview for another BBC podcast where they were asking me about this. And people often kind of say to me, I think people are keen to cast people as good and bad and evil and I think that's something that human beings have been doing for centuries. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of people I speak to who believe these kinds of conspiracies are actually very good people who believe it from a place of, and you guys know this better than me, but who believe it from a place of caring deeply, but also experiencing other kinds of distrust and skepticism and all sorts of other stuff. And unfortunately, it can lead to this point where actually, there is real harm being done to people. And I hope that maybe by watching or listening the kinds of reporting I do, they might be able to see that.
Are there any conspiracy theories that you would entertain at all? Or are you very blanket? No, so there's always usually an explanation.
I think that, I definitely think Santa's real.
Okay, well, let's do a sliding scale. Would you entertain the fact that we might not be alone in the universe?
Possibly. I think that I kind of don't feel that dismissive, actually, of kind of the wide range of conspiracy theories that are more... the thing I find hard is when you can see their real world impact very directly. There might be aliens, there might be people out there. I don't know, that's not really doing harm to anyone. In fact, it kind of gives some people quite a lot of hope, and it makes them think, oh, maybe there's something...
The lizards and all that, I don't know, they're doing harm.
But that's the problem is as you guys know, it's a very slippery slope. And once you get into it, getting closer and closer to the more harmful stuff is happens quite quickly. And so it's not sort of something that I've ever been interested in as a hobby, but I'm someone who, I'm really interested in stuff like true crime. I've always been quite interested in kind of like murder investigations and looking at how stuff, like the internet sleuths who kind of can figure out who's done what. I've always been really interested in that kind of stuff. And so I get it. Like I get why it kind of grips people and why they want the answers and why they want to figure stuff out. And I'm always the first person to say that people who believe conspiracy theories are not stupid at all. In fact, quite the opposite. They're like hyper curious and really engaged and intelligent.
So you with this sort of true crime angle or something, like, you might be interested in potential conspiracy around, say, the death of Daniel Morgan or Dr. David Kelly or something like that, because they're sort of more grounded in reality, but you're just not really interested in whether the Queen's a lizard or not. It's
Yeah,
just not your cup of tea.
I'm not. I don't think the Queen's a lizard. I'm interested as well in, like you're talking about Daniel Morgan and stuff like that. You know, where there are like very valid examples of, or where there are examples or questions about police conduct or government or roles that, you know, I think that it's really vital that we interrogate those. And actually, my job has to coexist with all kinds of other journalists investigating those things and holding power to account and exposing them, because then we can say, look, bad things happen, really bad things happen, and people abuse their power and people do horrible things and they need to be held to account. But at the same time, there are harmful falsehoods and conspiracy theories and abuse that can also cause real world harm, and we kind of have to be careful that we sort of unpick those two different.
With that in mind, what's your view on the online safety bill? Because I've seen that you seem to be quite a champion of it. Like, what the conspiracy world is concerned about is that it's going to be used as a tool to basically block dissent against the government. I know that recently the lawful or legal but harmful thing has been taken out of it. But what would you say to people that have that concern, and why do you think it's such a good thing?
I would begin by saying I'm not actually a champion of it. I mean, I would say that, you know, as I always say, I'm a correspondent, I'm a reporter, I'm not a campaigner. I think that lots of the reporting I've done and the investigations I've done for Panorama, for example, the most recent one that really sort of touched on this being about a little boy called Ollie, a 13-year-old who was murdered in Reading, and the role social media played in what happened to him, particularly sort of violence and bullying. They raise serious questions of the social media companies, and I think for the families affected. So certainly Ollie's mum and dad, who are two of the bravest people I've ever met, who are incredibly courageous and who've had a terrible experience. They just want to feel like policymakers are doing something to protect kids like Ollie, and they feel really helpless because for them, I remember so well kind of talking to Ollie's dad, and Ollie's dad kind of said to me, you know, I'm sitting in this field where like I'm with my son who is dying. It's absolutely the most like, I mean, this whole interview, I basically couldn't stop crying. Poor Andrew and Stuart were like talking to me, and they were crying, and I was crying. And they kind of said, but these bosses in Silicon Valley, they are miles away. They are in these glamorous buildings, and they make these decisions that can have a detrimental impact on our lives. And you know, they would say, and actually, everyone I interviewed for Disaster Trolls would say that they are all about freedom of speech, and they don't want to limit people's ability to have opinions or anything like that. But what they do want is politicians who they voted to represent them to feel like they're sticking up for things that affect them. And they are interested in the idea that there could be better regulation of the social media companies. And obviously, as you point out, you know, there are concerns that could pose a problem when it comes to freedom of speech, particularly who's deciding, you know, who decides what the companies need to do or not. I think that the plan they've come up with right now, with this idea of Ofcom being the kind of regulator and being the people who have to hold the social media companies to account, is their first attempt at kind of distancing that from the government itself, so that it's actually, and you know, I know people who work at Ofcom who are really great experts in topics like disinformation and hate, who people you guys would find really interesting to talk to, and who are very knowledgeable on the subject, and that reassures me to some extent that there are people who get this, because you know, we all know that there are some people who really don't get this. But it's one of the reasons, you know, this whole legal but harmful debate, should we define what's legal but harmful for adults and require the social media companies to do more about it? And that includes stuff like hate targeting women, or racist hate, or other issues like that. It actually includes some of the kinds of conspiracy theories targeting the Manchester Arena survivors. You know, all of that kinds of stuff falls into that scope. And ultimately, at its heart, the online safety bill is basically looking for the social media companies to make commitments and then show that they've upheld those commitments. I think the bigger issue, and certainly if you're someone that's worried about sort of holding accountable big rich companies, is that actually, you know, when I look at it, people like Amanda and Stuart and Ollie's mum and dad and the Manchester survivors, they are the real people. Like they are the people who are actually being massively affected by huge companies that earn a lot of money. And so when you look at the online safety bill in that prism, and that doesn't change that, you know, politicians are politicians, and you're absolutely right to question and interrogate what they're saying. But it does just, if you look at it through that lens, it for me personally, all I can kind of do is look at the evidence of the investigations I've done, and I just know that that's what they would want. They would want something, but that doesn't mean that the online safety bill in its current form would answer their questions and would actually resolve those issues. Some of it comes down to, you know, some people would argue the online safety bill has been way too complicated and that dropping the legal harmful thing is a good idea. Some people would argue it's just way too late, that this is kind of too late to do this. And actually, like, it's, and, you know, we've now got Musk owns Twitter, and Musk has got a very different approach, or at least a different kind of ethos around disinformation and trolling and everything else.
Elon Musk. Oh dear. To me, Elon Musk reminds me of a 55-year-old bloke that's bought a Harley Davidson and a leather jacket, and he's sat outside a comprehensive school revving the engine to try and impress some hard lads from the fifth form. He's the saddest man on the planet. Like, no, some people in that school might see this and go, wow, a Harley Davidson. Most people with life experience go, that is a lonely, lonely man with only money to comfort him. And it's just, I find it tragic. I appreciate we've only got you for a few.
My laugh is no endorsement, Elon Musk, if you're watching this.
He'll come after you. So with regards to all of that, you looking at disinformation, the online safety bill and stuff like that, do you think it's overly complicated by the fact that we've got mainstream media and we've got politicians, particularly in America, embracing conspiracy culture, like very, very much embracing this dot connecting opinions as news, and they're selling it as news? You know, I mean, personally, I would aim that at your Tucker Carlson's, your people like your Candace Owens, your GB Newses even, and stuff like that. They are aping things that they've seen Alex Jones do because it draws an audience.
I think that we can't ignore the fact that the media is part of this ecosystem, and the media is itself guilty at times of pushing disinformation or promoting conspiracy theories or playing a part in that. You know, we can't pretend that this is just something that happens organically on social media or that is driven by conspiracy theorists or other people. You know, that is all plays into it. Politicians can play into it. The media can play into it. All kinds of people can. And I think that part of our job, and I certainly found this, well, when we were investigating disinformation around the war in Ukraine, for example, we look quite a lot at the role that Russian state media plays in pushing certain disinformation narratives. And, you know, that's not unique to Russia. That happens happens all over the world in different ways. So we absolutely can't ignore it. It also contributes to kind of a certain amount of polarization and a certain amount of, you know, there are people who are so kind of captured in their certain media bubbles and their certain filter bubbles that they are never ever going to, you know, they're going to immediately believe things that play into their existing biases, and they're never going to believe things that contradict their existing biases. And that's that. And that's not, you know, a healthy place when we're talking about people being able to interrogate what's disinformation and what's not, and what's true and what's false. And so it's one of the reasons why I actually am a big champion of impartiality, because I think that it's hard in the social media age to be impartial. And I always think that you have to think of impartiality, certainly in the job I do, is about this due impartiality, this idea that you don't give false and true ideas the same amount of airtime. You're actually saying this is wrong and harmful, and here's why. But you also are able to kind of step back and be this kind of objective, impartial observer. And I've certainly found that with kind of covering America, because I present Americast, the podcast, and we have these undercover voters where I've set up these dummy profiles and I use them to interrogate sort of what they're seeing on social media. And I've had a really positive response from American audiences, because they're like, oh, it's great, because kind of we don't have this from our broadcasters in the same way. Whereas you guys are kind of like the Brits. You're like the Brits over there with your phones kind of interrogating as well. It's really refreshing, because most of the time I'm dealing, or not most of the time, but I'm often dealing with a committed minority of trolls who absolutely hate the BBC and distrust it at its core. But when I'm dealing with the US, funnily enough, I don't often have quite the same interaction.
You do have one person who wasn't very much of a fan of your undercover voters. in
Oh,
America.
Donald Trump Jr.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Have you wound him up? Oh, well played.
Yeah. He tweeted out my undercover voters, accusing the BBC of being fake news. And we've repeatedly asked him if he wants to come on Americast to talk to me all about them, but he's yet to take up our offer. So if he's
Oh, what a
listening,
shame.
someday I call it conspiracy.
Yeah, I think he's a fan, yeah.
I did a tweet afterwards and I joked, oh, we've got a new fan for the undercover voters. And then a news site wrote it up. And I was like,
Oh, marvellous. Have you heard the conspiracy theory that you're a Russian agent?
Oh, I've heard that lots. I've heard that
Oh, yeah?
loads. My response to that is always that. I did study Russian, which I'm very open about, and which I think if I was a spy, I might be a bit more secretive about.
Yeah, but that's the double bluff, though, isn't it, surely?
Maybe, but also I would say that I would genuinely, and you have both met me, I would be a terrible spy. I'm very good at finding things out and then telling them to people. I'm not very good at any kind of spying. So I think I would be very rubbish at that. And I hope that a lot of the kind of investigations I've done, if they listen to War on Truth, for example, on Radio 4, I'd be a very dangerous Russian spy if I was doing reporting like that. I don't think I'd be here anymore.
So you'd be prepared to swear on Lenin's beard that you're not a Russian spy?
I swear on Lenin's beard that I'm not a Russian spy.
Fantastic.
I've been in Lenin's mausoleum many times, in fact, but I've seen his beard in its very static way.
In regards to impartiality, some people have raised concerns that you've got Tim Davie and Richard Sharp at the head of the BBC, who are both connected to the British government. Some might say the British government is corrupt. Is this in any way problematic?
My experience at the BBC, from dealing with a whole range of people, from people at the very top to people who are lower down, has always been that they have at their heart that same philosophy of interrogating stuff in the public interest and doing our job as public service broadcasters. I mean, I'm certainly not important enough at the BBC to kind of be vetting everyone of every level, but I can certainly say from my personal experience, and you guys have also met, members of my team and the people I work with, that absolutely people are there because they want to interrogate what's happening. They want to reveal the truth. They want to hold, power to account. That doesn't mean they get it right all the time. The BBC can make mistakes, and it does. And I think it's really important that the BBC is totally transparent about that, and it holds up its hands when it gets things wrong and it explains why. And one of the things that we're doing even more at the BBC is actually showing our workings. And you probably kind of heard it in Disaster Trolls, but we tried to explain why we decided to investigate that topic and how we do a doorstep and how we, the different decisions that we kind of make as broadcasters and journalists when we do reporting. And I hope that will increase trust in the BBC, because people can actually see our workings and we say, look, this is how we do it. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay. We're going to have to address the elephant in the room, I'm afraid. Jimmy Savile, how old were you? When did you
that was long
work for the BBC?
That was long before my time. So I started at the BBC in 2018.
So it would be unfair to lay any of the blame at your door. That seems reasonable, fair enough. What's the culture like at the BBC now? Is there any way that something like a Jimmy Savile could happen again?
My experience, and I can only talk about sort of my experience at the BBC, has been very positive. I sort of work with editors and teams who encourage a very positive culture, who are really sort of alive to any fears or worries or questions people have, who really encourage sort of brave and bold reporting, but that kind of filters back to brave and bold conversations at work and people sticking up for stuff if they're wrong or calling something out. So my experience has been very positive. And I certainly find that the Savile stuff is stuff that comes up time and time again when I'm sent abuse, particularly from people who distrust the BBC. And I'm always the first person to say, I totally get it. I think it's just terrible that could happen in that way. And I hope my time at the BBC, nothing like that would happen in that way. It's certainly not in the teams that I work in. And I know that if people felt like they needed to raise something, I luckily work with very good editors. I also think that I work in a bit of the BBC that is quite new and fresh. This is a new area they're covering. This is a lot of people who have a real interest in disinformation and hate, and making sure that we call out. I can't be reporting on abuse and disinformation if I'm not calling it out I'm at work.
As a representative of the BBC, do you think it's high time that somebody apologises for Mrs. Brown's Boys?
I don't think that'll be happening. I really like Mrs. Brown Boys.
Do you?
Mum, Dad. Yeah, I know.
Oh, but you're an intelligent woman. What's going on there?
Only my parents. And my parents
Okay.
are really nice. My parents would love someday call it conspiracy. They don't do interviews on disaster.
Oh, well, if they want to come on, feel free. The other thing that was immediately asked when we announced, so we appreciate you were 16 when Jimmy Savile died. The other thing that immediately was asked when we said we're going to get a representative of the BBC on was, are you aware of the conspiracy theory regarding Building 7, 9/11 and the BBC? If you're not, essentially, Building 7 was the Solomon Brothers building. It collapsed. It was reported by the BBC that it collapsed 20 minutes before it collapsed, but was actually visible in frame behind. And then mysteriously, as the building was just about to collapse, the feed cut. Now, again, we appreciate that you were probably, I don't know, a teenager when this happened.
5 years old.
Yeah.
Bloody hell.
It's the first
so
news
unfair.
event that it's the first news event that I remember. It's actually the thing that I think got me interested in journalism, because I remember thinking, what is this? And I remember really well my mum collecting me from primary school, and all the kind of teachers were talking to the parents, kind of like, oh my God, have you seen what's happened? And I asked my mum when we were walking home, and my sister was really little. She was like 2 or 3. She was like in nursery. And I said, oh, Mum, what's happened? And my mum said, oh, some people have flown some planes into a building. And I said, oh, was it an accident? Because I just couldn't understand that people would do bad things on purpose. And she said, no, it wasn't an accident. And that really has always stayed with me. I actually think and I found it interesting because actually that was such a kind of, as you know, place where conspiracy theories were born from. And that's the topic I've ended up covering. In terms of that specific allegation, I definitely was sort of too little to...
Well, sure. Is there like is there an explanation? You as a journalist, you might be sat there and going, oh, it's very obvious what's happened. They've got the message confused or something like that. Is there a standard BBC explanation for it?
Not that I know of, but my kind of immediate instinct on that question would be that actually I think the culture has probably changed quite a lot since then in terms of how the BBC would respond. So if there was any kind of confusion or questions or people, for whatever reason, the picture had cut at a different time or there was a lag or I don't know, whatever could explain it. I feel like nowadays we would be much quicker to say, this is what happened and here's how it happened and why. Whereas back then, I think that that's something that's really changed about broadcast media in particular. And I think social media has changed it for good, which is that there's much more of a kind of rapport with the audience, whereas before it was like you're broadcasting to people and they're listening to you and that's that. And they're thinking, hang on a second, what were you saying? Whereas now it's much more of a kind of relationship. I can do a podcast with you guys really easily. 20 years ago, I couldn't have
You've not got the access, have you?
So my gut would be that whatever explanation is given for that, whether it was an error or whether it was something to do with lag or I don't know, that it might be the kind of thing that the BBC was not as transparent about at the time. I know that there was a conspiracy files that looked specifically at that used to be on BBC Two from kind of early 2010 time, and it looked at the 7/7 bombings, but it also looked at 9/11, and I think they may have possibly addressed it in that, but I haven't watched the whole thing through enough to remember.
Fair enough. One thing that someone wanted to know, is Laura Kuenssberg a plant for the Tory government? Because she does certainly seem to handhold Boris Johnson through some of his more turbulent times, shall we say.
She is not, no. And all of my experience of Laura, she is she's a very tenacious and brave and supportive journalist who's always been particularly nice to me, especially around the kind of online abuse I've experienced, and that's something she's experienced a lot. But I don't really work with the politics team they actually work in a different building at the BBC. But my experience of her has always been that she's a very, very good journalist.
Okay, thank you. So obviously, just to wrap up, like you obviously must get a tsunami of abuse and trolls and stuff like that. And, it's a horrible sort of area, that social media. What's your advice for people dealing with that type of thing? Not just, people involved in conspiracy theories, anybody. You must have developed some sort of like coping tactics.
Yeah, so I think that one thing, the first thing I think is really important is that people speak out about it. Never feel like you've got to just sort of sit there in silence, and never think that the abuse you're experiencing is just sort of too little or not enough. Occasionally people will say to me, oh, I've had this nasty abuse, but, it's nothing compared to X person, Y person. And actually, any kind of online abuse in any way can be not very nice to experience. And it can be just really helpful to talk to someone you trust, or someone close to you, or someone you work with. In my case, often I'll talk to editors or people at the BBC about it. And I actually think that's part of it. I personally find it really helpful to investigate it and expose it and look at the tactics, because I feel like I'm doing something. I find it quite hard to sort of just sit there and not do anything. I don't tend to sort of argue and reply to people very much. Although today, actually, for one of the first times in ages, I replied to someone because I was on the Today programme on Radio 4. I was talking about Elon Musk's comments about Anthony Fauci and Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Oh, yeah.
US. And we'd interviewed him on Americast last week, and he spoke about the online abuse he experiences. But we also obviously grilled him about his pandemic policies and decisions he made. And someone replied saying to me, something like, oh, well, shouldn't we be able to ask questions of people in power? And I honestly said that about 5 times in this live. And so I said, if you would just listen to the Americast episode and listen to the clip you're commenting on, that answers your question. And funnily enough, he didn't reply again.
That is the big question, though. How do we get people from just listening to a clip to listening to a full episode?
I think it is when people feel like, I do actually think that the empathy thing is really, really important. And it's when people feel like you are willing to engage and that you want to listen to them and you want to understand. I think that very dismissive attitude, and I know you guys kind of agree with this, but that very dismissive attitude towards conspiracy theories and to trolling and to everything else makes the problem a lot worse rather than making it better. And I think overall it's really important that we increase the public's understanding of this topic and this area. And so it's important it's on people's radars, but beyond that, and it's important that they understand how it works and why it works, and that people are, they feel like there's going to be some level of empathy. And I'm always struck by, the number of people who are willing to speak to me, particularly when they actually do engage with the output, when they listen to the podcast or when they read the online piece, or when they, they're much more willing to say, okay, yeah, I'll sit down and talk to you. And I'm always delighted when, there are people who, actually a very good example was Alicia, who we interviewed for Disaster Controls. I was so happy to hear that she felt like she had been fairly and accurately represented, and that she, that's really important. And so I like to think that if people at least maybe think I'm not an evil spy Satan, and they think I could be actually someone they might quite like to have a chat with, that is part of the journey. And even speaking to you guys, and your audience is different and certainly more involved in this world than my audience at the BBC is. And so if someone listening to this thinks, oh, actually, maybe she's not that bad, or at least maybe I might give her a sort of fair hearing, even if they don't like the BBC, but they might engage with my journalism, then
that's where I'm at. I was struck by just how normal you all are. Really, like I had obviously this image built up in my head of what BBC journalists would be like, and every step of the way, like dealing with our interviews, you were involved in every single step. There wasn't like you had assistants or other handlers or anyone doing anything. You did everything with Ant.
Yeah, and also I think that those moments, I've tried to capture it a bit in the book I'm writing, but all those moments behind the scenes, like even just us sitting like eating sandwiches when we were doing that filming, you guys are chatting about your next episode of a podcast, and us listening, and we found that so interesting. And it's just like all those little moments that are like everyone is there and everyone is, everyone is the same. And like you really find that when you're in the interview room or when you're doing an interview, that like, it's really bad if it feels like there's like, snazzy, important journalists. And then like, that's just not how it should work. It should feel like you're able to have a conversation, because that's when people say the most insightful things, because they feel comfortable and at ease and they want to share it with you. And if people are on the defensive, and it gets, and that's different when you're interviewing a politician, for example. When you're interviewing a minister or a politician or a prime minister or whoever, you've obviously got to, it's a different kind of relationship. But the sorts of interviews I do tend to be much more with people where I genuinely do want to understand, and I genuinely do want answers to the questions. And I hope that people can kind of hear that in me. And the people I work with, like Ant, like Alice, like Tom, who you guys met, are all really, really good people who genuinely do want to understand and would never want to cause upset to people or make them feel bad in any way.
Excellent.
That's excellent. What have you got in the pipeline? Are there any?
Yeah, I have a few things. So I'm working on the next Radio 4 podcast, but that's a little bit hush hush at the moment, but kind of going further, hopefully might be able to get you guys involved, but going further into understanding and unpicking how the UK conspiracy industry works, the UK conspiracy factory, and kind of investigating that. So no doubt Ant and I will be in touch soon. And then I'm also doing an investigation about Twitter, specifically looking at kind of the policy changes happening on the inside and the way that that's playing in the outside world, especially when we look at topics like disinformation and hate. Yeah. And I'm also looking at TikTok and the real world harm TikTok can cause, specifically the kind of witch hunts and kind of vigilantism that can derive from TikTok, and actually a bit on that issue of true crime, but how the algorithm can drive this kind of almost frenzied approach to certain stories. And sometimes that might be able to help solve a case, but in other scenarios, it can lead to people being wrongly accused of playing a part in something that they haven't, and so on. And so if there's anyone listening to Some Dare Call It Conspiracy affected by any of those things, then they are welcome to drop me a message.
Excellent. And when are you hoping that your book's going to be out?
Not until it's a very long process with books. I'm not released next sort of the latter half of next year.
Oh wow!
So the book launch. Don't you
lovely.
worry.
Yeah, we'll definitely be there. Oh, I'm sorry.
You'll have to come back for that.
Forever now, Marianna.
I'm going to invite everyone who I'm going to hope to invite. Well, not everyone, but most of the people who feature in some way in the book, because it's quite nice if people sort of meet each other, and all the kinds of people I work with, which is nice as well.
Fantastic.
I have to actually finish the book first. I should say that. Any of the publishers I work with are listening.
Yeah, but you're too busy. How are you going to finish it?
I just do it. I do it sort of in my spare time. So over Christmas and at weekends and stuff like that. I find it quite good sort of breaking it down into chapters. So now I'm at the point of doing edits. It's actually easier to kind of, you work on one chapter specifically and then you submit that and you work on another and submit that. But it's really interesting for me because I'm used to editing, scripts and stuff for online and broadcast, but actually doing a book is like a whole nother thing. And I hope that will have a sort of flavour of personality as well as the kind of behind the scenes and the stuff that tells people more about the big picture and what it means and why it matters.
Thank you so much for joining us. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Now that was excellent. All right. Thank you for listening. By the way, be sure to follow us on Twitter to keep up with all our future episodes. We are at Some Dare Podcast. You can follow Neil at Neil Sanders MC. And follow myself at Brent Lee SDCIC. And follow Marianna at Marianna Spring. And here's a final message from Marianna Spring.
During the course of this interview, I mentioned Disaster Trolls, a 10-part Radio 4 podcast series that's available on BBC Sounds, as well as the Panorama investigation that looks at the same topic. For those, we approached Richard D. Hall for comment. We confronted him at the market stall he was running at the time, where he insisted we were wrong about how he operated. After that, the BBC wrote to Hall again, but he didn't respond. He then posted a new video saying that he didn't put a camera outside the home of a Manchester Arena survivor, but admitted to leaving a camera rolling in his van parked in a public place. He says his door-to-door inquiries are polite and he can't be held responsible for people sending abuse online, but he held firm to his, quote, opinion that there has been no satisfactory evidence presented to the public which proves that the Manchester Arena incident was not staged.